Asterisk flashing red and blue lights pierce through the darkness on a quiet suburban street. The reflection bounces off the rearview mirror of a pristine black Mercedes S-Class as it pulls over to the curb. Behind the wheel sits a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit. A federal judge who has spent over 2 decades serving justice from the bench. Asterisk. It was supposed to be a routine drive home after a late evening at the courthouse. The judge had just finished reviewing cases for the next day's proceedings when he noticed the patrol car tailing him for the past 3 blocks. As an African-American man who had worked his way up from humble beginnings to one of the highest positions in the judicial system, he was no stranger to these situations. But tonight would prove different from any encounter he'd experienced before. The officer approaches, flashlight beam dancing across the luxury vehicle's polished exterior. 20 years on the bench means the judge knows exactly how these stops should proceed, the proper protocols, the legal boundaries, the constitutional rights. Yet something in the officer's demeanor immediately sets off warning bells. The usual questions come with an edge of unwarranted suspicion, despite the judge's calm and professional responses. License and registration, the officer demands, his hand resting deliberately on his holstered weapon. No explanation for the stop. No statement of probable cause, just tension crackling through the night air like static before a storm. What happens next would not only test the limits of both men's professional restraints, but would spark a conversation that would ripple through their entire community. This incident would force everyone, from the highest chambers of the courthouse to the local police precinct, to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and prejudice in modern America. This is a story about what happens when authority meets authority, when the scales of justice face off against the badge of law enforcement. But more importantly, it's a story about human dignity, about standing up for what's right, and about how one unexpected encounter can become a catalyst for real change. As the judge reaches for his credentials, decades of legal experience battle with the raw emotion of the moment. He's presided over countless cases involving police misconduct, but now he finds himself on the other side of the bench. His next words and actions would need to be carefully chosen. They could either escalate the situation or transform it into something entirely unexpected. The dash cam quietly records every word, every movement, every subtle shift in power dynamics. Neither man knows that by sunrise, this footage would be in the hands of the police chief and the story would begin spreading through social media like wildfire. Neither realizes that their late-night encounter is about to become so much bigger than both of them. In the next few minutes, everything this judge believes about justice, everything this officer thinks he knows about authority, and everything our society assumes about power and privilege will be put to the test. What unfolds next isn't just another viral video of a traffic stop gone wrong. It's a moment that would challenge perspectives and change lives forever. Asterisk, the officer leans down to the window, squinting at the judge's credentials under his flashlight beam. His expression shifts, but not in the way anyone might expect. What happens next would leave both men forever changed and prove that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments. Asterisk, as the beam of light illuminates the judge's credentials, the officer's facial expression transforms from stern authority to visible confusion. The gold-embossed federal judicial badge gleams under the flashlight, forcing him to confront an uncomfortable reality. The man he pulled over for what he claimed was a routine traffic stop holds more legal authority than anyone he's encountered in his 15 years on the force. But instead of backing down, something unexpected happens. The officer straightens his back, jaw clenching visibly. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he commands, his voice carrying an edge that sends a chill through the night air. The judge, well versed in both law and human nature, recognizes this as a critical moment. His decades of experience tell him this officer is now feeling threatened not by any physical danger, but by the challenge to his assumed authority. The dashcam continues its silent vigil as the judge carefully weighs his options. He knows his rights, knows he could refuse, knows he could call the police chief, who he's worked with on numerous community initiatives. But he also understands that this moment could be something more important than just another tense traffic stop. This could be an opportunity for real dialogue, for breaking down barriers that have divided communities for generations. Inside the patrol car, the officer's body camera records every word, every gesture, every subtle shift in power dynamics. What it captures next would later become required viewing at police academies across the country. The judge slowly opens his door, his movements deliberate and calm. Standing at his full height, his presence commands respect, not through intimidation, but through dignity. "Officer," the judge begins, his voice steady and measured, "before we continue, I'd like to understand why I was pulled over tonight." The simple question hangs in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. The officer's hand still rests near his weapon, but something in the judge's demeanor makes him pause. The surrounding neighborhood sleeps peacefully, unaware of the profound moment unfolding on their quiet street. Houses with warm lights glowing through windows stand as silent witnesses to what happens when prejudice meets wisdom, when fear confronts understanding. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for these two men, but for a community struggling to bridge its deepest divides. Behind the officer's stern facade, conflict plays across his features. His training taught him to maintain control of every situation, but nothing in the police academy prepared him for this. The judge sees something familiar in the young officer's eyes, the same look he's witnessed countless times in his courtroom when someone is forced to confront their own biases. The night air grows thicker with tension as neighborhood dogs bark in the distance. A car passes slowly, its occupants rubbernecking at the scene, another reminder that in today's world, every interaction between law enforcement and civilians carries the weight of history and the potential for change. As the judge stands there, briefcase still in hand, he realizes this encounter could go one of two ways. It could become another statistic, another headline, another reason for communities to drift further apart. Or it could become something else entirely, a moment of transformation, a chance to bridge the divide between the badge and the bench. The officer's next words would determine which path this story would take. His hand finally drops from his weapon, and he takes a deep breath. What he says next would not only change the course of both their lives, but would also become a turning point in how their entire community views the relationship between law enforcement and the justice system. "I pulled you over because your vehicle matches the description of one involved in a reported incident." The officer finally speaks, his voice betraying a mix of uncertainty and stubbornness. But the judge, having presided over thousands of cases, immediately recognizes the telltale signs of a manufactured excuse. The Mercedes he's driving is hardly unique in this affluent suburb, and no specific details about this alleged incident are forthcoming. A gentle breeze rustles through the trees as the judge makes a decision that would later be described as a masterclass in de-escalation. Instead of challenging the officer's obvious pretext, he reaches slowly into his briefcase. The officer tenses, but the judge simply pulls out a business card. "Officer, I want you to take a look at something," he says, his voice carrying the same measured tone he uses in his courtroom when making a point that could change someone's perspective forever. The card trembles slightly in the officer's hand as he reads it under his flashlight beam. It's not just any business card. It's an invitation to next week's Police Community Relations Summit, where the judge is scheduled to be the keynote speaker. The irony of the situation isn't lost on either man. Here they are, living out the very tensions they're supposed to be working to resolve. Suddenly, the crackle of the police radio breaks the silence. A dispatcher's voice cuts through the night. "All units be advised." But before the message can continue, another patrol car rolls up slowly, its headlights illuminating the scene in harsh white light. The arriving officer, a veteran sergeant, steps out and immediately recognizes the judge from their work together on youth outreach programs. The original officer's face drains of color as his sergeant approaches. He knows his dash cam has captured everything: the questionable stop, his aggressive stance, the hand on his weapon while confronting a respected federal judge. His career flashes before his eyes, but what he doesn't realize is that this moment is about to become something far more significant than a potential disciplinary action. The judge watches the internal struggle playing across the young officer's face and sees an opportunity, not for punishment, but for transformation. He's about to offer something that will leave everyone watching this video questioning their own assumptions about power, justice, and redemption. The sergeant opens his mouth to speak, but the judge raises his hand slightly, the same gesture he uses in his courtroom to signal that something important is about to be said. The tension in the air reaches its peak as all three men stand in a triangle of power dynamics and possibilities. The judge's next words would either tear open the wounds of distrust that plague police-community relations or begin a healing process that could ripple through their entire city. Behind them, more cars slow down to observe the scene. Cell phone cameras peek through windows, their owners unaware that they're about to witness something far more powerful than another viral video of police misconduct. The stakes couldn't be higher as the judge prepares to speak, but no one could have predicted what he would say next, or how it would change not just these three lives, but an entire community's understanding of justice and accountability. Before anyone says another word, the judge begins. "I want to share something that happened in my courtroom just this morning." His voice carries the weight of 20 years of wisdom from the bench. The sergeant and young officer exchange glances, unsure of where this is heading. The growing crowd of onlookers inches closer, sensing they're about to witness something extraordinary. "I had to sentence a young man today," the judge continues, his voice steady but touched with emotion. "A promising college student who made one mistake that could have cost him his future. But instead of sending him to prison, I chose a different path." The young officer's hand, which had been fidgeting with his badge, goes still. The sergeant's expression shifts from concern to curiosity. Just then, a text message lights up the judge's phone on the car dashboard, visible to all three men. It's from the police chief. "Incident reported. Media en route." The situation threatens to spiral into exactly the kind of confrontational headline everyone had been working to prevent in their community. But the judge doesn't flinch. Instead, he smiles, because this message only reinforces the importance of what he's about to say. "That young man reminded me of someone," the judge continues, looking directly at the young officer. "Someone who once stood before me in court, about 7 years ago." The officer's eyes widen with sudden recognition. His hand drops completely from his weapon as color drains from his face. The sergeant looks between them, sensing a connection he doesn't yet understand. The night air grows thick with anticipation as another patrol car's lights appear in the distance. The judge knows he has mere minutes before this intimate moment becomes a media circus. But rather than rush, he maintains his measured pace, understanding that what happens next could reshape not just one officer's perspective, but an entire department's approach to community policing. A gentle wind carries distant sirens, the media van's approaching. The young officer's body camera continues recording what's about to become one of the most watched police encounters in recent history. But not for the reasons anyone might expect. The judge takes one step closer, his next words about to reveal a connection between himself and this officer that nobody could have anticipated. The sergeant reaches for his radio, probably to call off the approaching media circus, but the judge gently shakes his head. "Let them come," he says softly, "because what happens next needs to be heard by everyone." The young officer's stance has completely changed now. Gone is the aggressive authority, replaced by something that looks almost like shame or perhaps hope. The judge opens his briefcase one more time, pulling out a familiar-looking document that makes the young officer's breath catch in his throat. It's a court record from 7 years ago, and what it contains would transform this tense traffic stop into a story of redemption that no one saw coming. As the media van's headlights appear around the corner, the judge prepares to reveal a truth that would challenge everything everyone thought they knew about justice, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. 7 years ago, the judge's voice carries across the now silent street. "I presided over a case involving a young man charged with assault. He was facing 5 years in prison, but something about him was different." The young officer's eyes are now fixed on the ground, his earlier bravado completely dissolved. The gathering crowd, including the newly arrived news crews, stands transfixed. That young man had just graduated from the police academy, the judge continues, when he got into a fight defending an elderly woman from harassment. His methods were wrong, but his heart was in the right place. The sergeant's eyes widen with realization. He's heard this story before, but never knew the judge involved. "Instead of prison, I sentenced him to community service, working with troubled youth. Today, that man wears a badge." The young officer looks up, tears welling in his eyes. "You're the reason I'm still a police officer," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew you were the same judge." The news crews inch closer, cameras rolling, capturing a moment of vulnerability and truth rarely seen between law enforcement and the judiciary. But the judge isn't finished. He pulls out one more document, a letter, creased and worn from being carried in his briefcase. "This arrived at my chambers last month," he says, handing it to the officer. "It's from one of the teens you mentored during your community service. He just graduated from the police academy himself." The officer's hands shake as he reads the letter, recognizing the name of a young man he'd helped turn away from gang life. The sergeant, understanding the magnitude of what's unfolding, steps forward. "This is why we need both accountability and compassion," he says, addressing not just the gathered crowd but the rolling cameras. "Sometimes the very people we profile could be the ones who helped shape our lives." Just then, the police chief's car pulls up, but instead of interrupting, he stands back, recognizing that something extraordinary is taking place. The judge places a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Tonight, you stopped me because of how I looked," he says firmly but kindly. 7 years ago, I looked past how you looked and saw who you could become. The question is, what will you do with your second chance at making this right?" The officer removes his badge, holding it out to his sergeant, a gesture of resignation. But the judge intercepts it. "No," he says, "this badge stays where it is, but from tonight forward, it carries a new responsibility." He turns to address the gathered media directly. "This isn't a story about a racist police stop. It's a story about how justice, real justice, sometimes comes full circle." The officer straightens his uniform, wipes his eyes, and does something unexpected. He turns to the cameras and begins to speak, not with prepared statements or defensive excuses, but with raw honesty about bias, about growth, and about the judge who gave him a chance to become a better person. As his words flow, the gathered crowd witnesses something rare and powerful, the moment when accountability meets opportunity, when past mistakes transform into future wisdom. The judge's phone buzzes one final time. It's another text from the police chief. "Turn on the evening news." Every station is carrying this live, but the judge just smiles, knowing that sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice don't happen in courtrooms, they happen on quiet suburban streets, when two men find the courage to transform a moment of confrontation into an opportunity for change. In the days that followed, the video of that night went viral, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Instead of adding to the growing divide between law enforcement and the community, it became a symbol of hope and transformation. The footage showed something rare in today's world, a moment of genuine human connection breaking through years of prejudice and misunderstanding. The young officer, rather than facing disciplinary action, was tasked with leading a new police department initiative. Working alongside the judge, he began conducting workshops for fellow officers about confronting unconscious bias and the power of second chances. His personal story, from nearly losing his career 7 years ago to becoming an agent of change, resonated deeply with both law enforcement and community members. At the Police Community Relations Summit, the following week, the judge and officer shared the stage. The summit, originally planned as a formal discussion of policies and procedures, transformed into something more meaningful. One by one, people from the community stood up to share their own stories of prejudice, redemption, and hope. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to understanding, from fear to possibility. The letter from the young cadet, the troubled teen the officer had mentored, was framed and hung in the police academy's main hall. Below it, a simple phrase became the department's unofficial motto: "Justice sees the person, not just the moment." New recruits would stop and read it, understanding that their badge carried the weight of both authority and opportunity. Local schools began inviting both the judge and officer to speak to students. Their stories sparked conversations about bias, forgiveness, and the importance of looking beyond first impressions. The teens, particularly those who had felt targeted by law enforcement, found hope in seeing how people could change and grow. The police chief implemented new training protocols based on this incident. Instead of just focusing on procedures and regulations, Officers now spent time learning about the power of human connection and the importance of recognizing their own biases. The department's approach to community policing shifted from enforcement to engagement. 6 months later, at a community celebration in the park where the officer had once done his community service, something remarkable happened. The elderly woman he had defended 7 years ago, the incident that had brought him before the judge, was there. She hugged both men, tears in her eyes, creating yet another moment of healing that reminded everyone present that every interaction carries the potential for positive change. The judge still keeps the dash cam footage on his phone, not as evidence of what went wrong that night, but as proof of what can go right when people choose understanding over anger, growth over judgment. He shows it sometimes in his courtroom, particularly when facing young offenders who think their mistakes define their future. As for the young officer, he still patrols the same streets, but with different eyes. Each traffic stop becomes an opportunity not just to enforce the law, but to demonstrate the kind of compassion that changed his own life. His badge now carries a weight he's proud to bear, the weight of responsibility, redemption, and the chance to prove that change is always possible. The story could have ended differently that night. It could have become another headline about division and distrust. Instead, it became a reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments of justice happen not in courtrooms or police stations, but in those brief encounters where we choose to see each other's humanity. As the judge often says now, closing his presentations with a smile, true justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about believing in the power of second chances and having the courage to transform moments of conflict into opportunities for change.